to do another book, I would certainly want to follow up on Charles Stoneham because he was such a strange man, interesting person, sort of a rogue, possibly a crook, certainly a bigamist. We know from the 1930 U.S. Census that he was married to two different women with two sets of children in two different locations. So he was quite a colorful person. But the problem when writing that book is, given the lifestyle that he led, he was a sort of Jay Gatsby type. He lived in the Jazz Age when, it was wide open. Everybody who had a drink and went to a party or went to a nightclub was breaking the law. The rise of the glory of the gangster, the Al Capone figures, and so on. He lived a very fast life in the 1920s, and he tried to cover his tracks. So the biographer's challenge was to write a life of a man who did everything he could to make that impossible. I had access to the family papers such as they were. The Stoneham family gave me as much material as they could, but I found that it was really more effective to look at the age in which he lived and let the age somewhat define him, as well as letting him more or less shed light on the age. His life ended in 1936 in a very painful way. He was drinking himself to death. His manager, when he knew the end was in coming, he turned to Bill Terry rather than his son Horace, adding mystery to this level of life that he lived. Rather than consult his family, he made it secret. He asked Bill Terry to come immediately from his home in Memphis and bring him to Hot Springs, Arkansas, where he went for a cure, but he was a bit too late. He lasted only about 3 weeks. Bill Terry was sworn to secrecy, but seeing that Stoneham was dying, he ended up calling his son Horace, who got on a train and went and managed to be there for the last 2 days of his father's life. Now, what's mysterious about this, and something that I've never really figured out, even though I've done so much work on this man's life, is the degree of secrecy that he managed to build into even his funeral. The funeral was held in New Jersey, where he was born and raised, Jersey City, New Jersey, at the Catholic Church, All Saints Church. But the only people that really knew about it were the clergy. The family, led by Horace, decided to have such a private ceremony as to tell Ford Frick and the owners of the leagues, in both cases, American and National, the wrong date for the funeral, not to attend. They told the local press a day later. They didn't want anyone there for fear that the second family might arrive and there might be some scandal at the church. So this was the difficulty in writing such a life, that this man, even in the end, he asked in writing that his funeral be private, that there be no public mourning. And this was in an era when, of course, the funeral of any celebrity was a huge issue. Think of John McGraw, who died only 2 years earlier in 1934. He was mourned with a high requiem mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City. Standing room only. There were about 5,000 people and another 5 trying to get in the church outside. Funeral procession down to the train. Another a trip to Baltimore, where John McGraw was his hometown, where he was feted there as well, with another memorial. This is the same age, and that Stoneham wanted so much to conceal everything about his life, including even the celebration of his life at the end. So this was part of the problem. To solve it, I started reading deeply in the not only the newspapers of the 1920s, but I returned to The Great Gatsby, the novel that defined the era, and found some tremendous parallels between the life of Charles Stoneham and the fictitious creation by Fitzgerald of Jay Gatsby, including dubious sources of wealth, rather marginal legal business deals, connections with Arnold Rothstein, the man who allegedly fixed the 1919 Black Sox World Series, who was in control of the New York Underground all through the 10s and the 20s, and was not only a personal friend of Charles Stoneham, and of course John McGraw as well, but he was a business associate of Charles Stoneham. So this is another aspect of Stoneham's life that I was able to, reading biographies of Arnold Rothstein, I was able to kind of put together a profile of this mysterious person. In the end, he gets he bought the Giants in 1919, and this was quite mysterious. All the newspapers had assumed that the club was, well, let me back up and say that the Hempstead family, who owned the Giants, were convinced because of World War I that baseball was a bad business, that baseball was going to lose its edge in American culture. The 1917 season was a big minus, a downfall in terms of attendance. And the man who was in charge of the books, John Hempstead himself, he decided that he would look at this as a business proposition. And 1918 proved even more that way, that the attendance went down again, that he wanted out. So he put the word out in the late fall or early fall of 1918 that the club's for sale. He was trying to protect the Bush family's interests in the club, and let John McGraw, who was more or less not only the manager on the field, but he was really the figurehead of the club, the face of the club. Hempstead gave McGraw permission to sort of shop, find out if he could get some buyers. And by the end of the year, December of 1918, there were two leading candidates. One of them was George Loft, the former congressman and Candyman, and there was George Cohen, the music man, the Broadway man. And according to the papers, the money, all the influence, the rumors was that Cohen would be the owner. And what a surprise that in January 15th of 1919, when New Yorkers opened their newspaper that morning, they discovered that there was a new owner of the Giants, and his name was Charles A. Stoneham, a kind of who-he reaction among the readers. Nobody knew who this fellow was. He was a dark horse. And that's how the Giants transfer began, with, of course, another mystery about this man coming out of nowhere to buy the most celebrated franchise in Major League Baseball at the time. His first 5 years were extraordinarily successful. Not only did Major League Baseball rebound from the 1918 attendance woes, it grew quickly after the war. People were excited about getting back to normal things, and entertainment was one of them, and baseball became big again. Not only did that happen, and Stoneham made plenty of money at the gate, his Giants were phenomenally successful, holding a record that still stands to this day: 4 straight National League pennants, and 4 straight World Series appearances, 2 of them against the rising Yankees with Babe Ruth. They won the 1921 and 1922 Subway Series, with the first of many. And then they lost to the Yankees in 23, and then they lost on a very exciting World Series to the Washington Senators in 1924. Now, this was great stuff for Stoneham, and his name was in the paper as the owner, of course, but he was, again, in characteristic fashion, he preferred to let McGraw, who was the face of the franchise, or his club secretary, do all the talking. He very rarely would give any. He would give interviews once in a while. He never wanted his picture taken, and he would never sit in his box except for formal ceremonials like the opening day. He would watch the games from his office in center field in the Polo Grounds. He was kind of in the background of everything and letting McGraw and the others have the headlines. This is how he operated as an owner. And then he got into some legal trouble with his businesses. He was a stockbroker in a very fast and loose aspect of Wall Street, which was called the curb exchange, where the regulations were less. You could get in for less money as a client, and of course you could leverage. And this was what the broker provided. And it was really a question of gambling with someone else's money, which Stoneham loved to do. He was quite a gambler himself. He was a member of the Partridge Club, which was Arnold Rothstein's floating crap game with New York, which was later celebrated in Guys and Dolls, with Nathan Detroit as the model based on Arnold Rothstein. But Stoneham also had racehorses and so on. So he was quite a gambler, along with McGraw. And when he sold his stock business, he wanted out completely, wanted to be a full-time sportsman. He sent letters and he sent his clients to these other firms that he knew about, but they were really undercapitalized and quickly failed in 2 or 3 years, causing all kinds of civil lawsuits first, and then some criminal activities where Stoneham was indicted twice, once for mail fraud on the first exchange of his clients, sending out letters. He was charged with sending out letters that didn't account for the dubious fragility of the capital, the finances of these firms. And in the second case, he was deposed a number of times and was basically asked if he was the silent partner in a second firm that he'd sent clients to, and he denied that. And it turned out that that was probably true, although again, a man with plenty of money and deep pockets and a terrible desire to always come out on top. He was quite tenacious in fighting back against the prosecutors and the attorneys, and he was acquitted of both indictments. So he avoided jail time and he avoided criminal charges. But this took away a lot of the wind from his sails, and he was contending with this while the Giants were going through the 20s, and they fell off in terms of their success. And it wasn't until 1933 when Bill Terry replaced John McGraw as the manager, which was a monumental seismic shift in New York Giants history. McGraw had been the face of the franchise since 1903. So in 1932, Stoneham replaces him mid-season with Bill Terry, and the Giants suddenly catch fire. They win the 1933 National League pennant and go on to beat the Washington Senators in a World Series. So Stoneham gets another championship. But he only had a couple of more years to live. And even though his doctor told him to go on the water wagon, he refused to do it and was dead by January of 1936. Now, it turns out that the team he built under Terry for 35 and 34 and 35 were also quite good. But in 36 and 37, the Giants win it all again in the National League, and they go on to play another set of Subway Series to the New York Yankees, losing both of those to a team that was featured in a young, brilliant rookie in 36 called Joe DiMaggio. And those were the years that the Yankees went on to become a real powerhouse. So what happens in the end? What do we say about this man, Charles Stoneham? What a character he was, what a rogue he was as a person. He resembles Jay Gatsby in so many ways. But what about him as a baseball man? Well, there are two distinct reviews of Stoneham. One of them is he gets bad marks. He gets bad marks from a number of baseball historians for taking what would many regard as the premier American sports franchise, not just baseball, but in all of American sports. Remember now that this is not quite so crowded as we are today with all kinds of professional sports to look at. Baseball was really the premier product. There was some boxing. Boxing was very big in the teens and the 20s, but this was considered, the New York Giants were considered a big, huge deal. And the critics say that Stoneham bought the team in 1919 and then used all of the capital and the profits from those turnstiles to simply run his Playboy lifestyle, jazz age giant lifestyle, and never reinvested as say the Yankees did under Rupert, would constantly hold back the dividends from the team and bring it back in and build the team again. Stoneham was accused of not doing that, letting the team languish. There's another side, another set of people that say no. Actually, he was very effective. He had while he didn't perhaps meet the standards of the Yankees, and if you compare him only to the Yankees in those years, where there were more championships on the Yankee side, certainly, Stoneham nonetheless was considered a valuable asset to baseball in the mid 30s. By the time he was in ownership for that long, the owners looked to him to be a rather model, a sage, really an old wisdom, sort of senior owner. They voted him onto many committees, many membership committees. So he was vice president of the National League for 3 years. So his life in baseball, if measured against the fulfillment and the influence he had on the game, not to mention maybe the fact that he had 3 world championships under his steward, a number of pennants, you'd have to give him fairly good marks. So the jury is out. I tend to side with the second group. I think in terms of a life of baseball, I think Stoneham has to be given credit for many things. I think that his personal life, the personal lifestyle, sort of overshadows in some way the ownership side. But I think in the end, the owners admired him, baseball admired him. His franchise in 1936 was certainly valued and remarkable. So in that sense, I say he probably deserves maybe better marks than those of the first school that I mentioned. So maybe stop there, John, and ask if there are any people who would like to maybe ask any questions.
I'll fire you a question, and then so everybody else can get ready to ask theirs. My question is, McGraw had an ownership stake once Stoneham took over. I believe that's correct. And what was the relationship between Stoneham and McGraw in the 1920s? It was kind of tumultuous, wasn't it?
Yes. Well, let's go to the first part of the question. McGraw had always wanted to have a piece of the action, and he never had any money. So I suspect that, and this is not something that you can recover. I mean, even I've been in touch with Bill Lamb, the Giants historian, who's written on SABR on a number of team histories, knows the New York Giants history very well, and he himself says it's very murky what really went on. We will probably never really know. But we can speculate, I think, that the reason that Stoneham came out of nowhere, his name wasn't even in the paper. No one knew, first of all, no one knew who Stoneham was. The sports writers all had to go to the morgues to find out who is this guy who just bought the Giants. He's not a baseball man. They discovered he was a racehorse fellow. He had a stable and he was a businessman. But I suspect that because McGraw was given more or less the green light to go out and find an owner, I suspect that what happened, Stoneham gave some concessions to McGraw about ownership, and he gave him a small stake. Now, he gave him 70 shares. He also gave Francis McQuaid, who was a magistrate judge in a Tammany Hall fixture, he gave him 70 shares. In McGraw's case, I think Stoneham was doing this for 2 reasons. One, that probably cinched the deal in terms of him as a buyer, certainly from McGraw's point of view. But he also realized he was not a baseball man. He did not know the game. He was a very astute businessman, very, very wealthy because of that. But he gave McGraw an awful lot of latitude and basically gave him run of the club in personnel. And the fact that he could tie him to the performance of the team by giving him some ownership, where he would be where McGraw would benefit made a lot of sense. It's not the same with Frank McQuaid. In Frank McQuaid's case, I think Stoneham was simply aware of the politics of the city, and the fact of having a Tammany Hall operative was a way of being politically savvy, and Stoneham was certainly that. But the second part of your question, what's the relationship between Stoneham and McGraw personally? And it was very strange and rocky, especially at the beginning. They argued a lot about things when they were both drinking men, of course, and so a lot of times when they were doing club business, they were doing so at night in various bars and so on. And especially, there's a famous account of a fist fight between Stoneham and McGraw. Most of the people who watched it said Stoneham won, but that's not surprising because McGraw lost most of his fights with people, according to his biographers. But he gradually, well, this is a complicated answer, John, because McQuaid started to become a real thorn in both Stoneham's case and in McGraw's case, and was constantly trying to get McGraw to argue and take a stand against Stoneham. Eventually, McGraw saw the light and realized he should line up more with Stoneham, and he made his peace with Stoneham. So toward the end of their career, they had a respectful, I won't say a close relationship. They weren't friends. They were business associates, but they were working together, and McQuaid was sort of on the outs. And eventually, McGraw and Stoneham got McQuaid off the board, which caused a lot of legal maneuvering and a bunch of lawsuits, which in the end, Stoneham prevailed. But it took a lot of energy and a lot of time away from the ball club to settle this between these owners. They were, as one of the attorneys said in the McQuaid suit against McGraw and Stoneham, these were rough men, drinking men, fighting men, all of the same ilk. So it's not surprising that their friendship or their relationship would be tumultuous. Your word is very correct.
Okay, we have two questions. Karen's got a question, and then that will follow up with Ed. Ed has a question. He's got his hand up. Okay, so go ahead, Karen.
I just wanted to know, what was his reputation as a person with two families and gambling and all these things? It's like when you're saying that he's like part of the Great Gatsby kind. What happened to the families?
This is an interesting moment for me. I'm trying to remember the exact year. I think it was 2021, but I could be wrong about the year. I managed through the Rupert family. Now, this is not the Ruperts who owned the Yankees. This is 1P, Rupert. This is Horace Stoneham's granddaughters. They got in touch with the other part of the family. Charles Stoneham is their great-grandfather. Horace was Charles Stoneham's son, who went on to bring the team to San Francisco, and that's the family line that the Rupert girls are from. But there is another set of children that Charles Stoneham reared, if you will, or raised, or begot, I guess the Bible says. So those were estranged from Stoneham. In fact, Horace Stoneham never met his half-brother and his half-sister. He insisted on not meeting them. Didn't want anything to do with them, was afraid that they would make claims. One of the things that Charles did was he set up a trust fund for these two children, and he gave the ball club to Horace. So that was his way of sort of legally dealing with these two sets of kids. His daughter, also Mary, his daughter, Horace and Mary both got sets, part of the team along with Horace's mother. And then eventually it all settled onto Horace. Meanwhile, the second set of families, they got a trust fund. Now, this is amazing, and it was so fortuitous for me that I was able to meet and interview Charles Stoneham's daughter from the second marriage in Los Angeles in I guess 2021. She is 97 years old. She was 95 when I interviewed her, so it must have been just a few years ago. It was pre-COVID, I think, or maybe post-COVID, doesn't matter. I got to interview her. And she told me some incredible things about her father, namely that he was such a distant figure. She hardly knew him. She was 13 years old when he died. Her brother was 16 years old when he died. They used to go to the Polo Ground, she said. No one paid attention to them. They got very nice seats on first base. They had an usher bring them a box, which included popcorn and hot dogs, but they never saw anybody. Nobody paying attention to them from the Giants, except these ushers. So she spoke about him. She said that McGraw wasn't so much a figure at the dinner table at their house as Bill Terry was. Bill Terry came more to dinner. I asked her questions about, did she meet McGraw? She said, not really. I met him only once or twice, but it was such a formal greeting. And he never came to the house, but Bill Terry did, she remembered. But to your point and to your question, Charles Stoneham was not close to any of his children. He was really not close. He really didn't have any real friends, we'd have to say. McGraw was certainly not a friend. Arnold Rothstein, 25-year business association, was not a friend. He seemed to be a loner, a self-made loner, as far as I can tell from all the things in his life. The children went on. His second set of children ended up in Los Angeles in the not movie business, television, entertainment business. The other set of children eventually ended up in Northern California because of the team moving to San Francisco. And that's where they lived.
Okay, thank you.
Ed, you have a question.
Yeah, thank you. I was kind of curious, kind of a follow-on from Karen's question, but I'm kind of wonder what it was like back in the day with the press, how much they could dwell on things like this and dig in. I know there was a period, for example, where FDR, they never reported on the fact he was in a wheelchair, and Babe Ruth, they didn't really talk to a lot of the things that he had done, and people kind of like to not tear down idols perhaps as much as they do these days. How much did the press know about Stoneham, and how much was public to the people, in addition to just the family, but all the other issues that would probably raise a big stink right now if a current owner had done these same sort of things?
Well, I'm not sure what the press knew. I can tell you what the press wrote about. And you're absolutely right. They did not get into any private matters. There was a code as you alluded to, there was a code that you sort of didn't talk about anything that was in any way off color or nefarious or anything like that. It was a code among the writers, especially the sports writers. There was very little. I mean, Babe Ruth's girlfriends were, a well-known secret, if that's the right word to use. How can something be well-known and be a secret? But everybody knew about this. But it wasn't just Babe Ruth. It was many people. To take the mayor, Jimmy Walker, he had a mistress that he was living with his mistress as much as he was living with his wife. The great, they called him the great mouthpiece, William Fallon, who's the attorney who represented all the Broadway types in the 20s. He himself had a mistress that he was living with him, and they didn't report on that. William Randolph Hearst, a big name in the 20s, and he had another life. There were so many of these other lives around, and Stoneham himself was a man of his time. He had another life. This was never reported on. It never came up in any of the depositions when he was in court, when he had to answer questions. He could be very, I wouldn't say duplicitous, but he could be very dissembling when he would answer questions, but nothing personal was asked. And in the 1930s, particularly, when reporters would follow baseball teams, they were very aware that there was a limit on what they could cover. they wanted to be entertaining, but at the same time, they wanted to make sure that they didn't stray. They didn't break any of the codes about locker room codes or clubhouse codes or when a player goes on the road, how much do you talk about what the player does off the field? These were all, you might say, writerly codes that they more or less respected. When I dug into the immediate reaction to Charles Stoneham's death, which came in the 2nd and 3rd and 4th week of January 1936, it was astonishing. One writer even said, with respect, I quote this in the book, so I'm probably not going to get it exact, but he wrote, with respect to his life, we will confine our remarks to Charles Stoneham as a baseball man. I mean, he even went so far as to put that in writing. And what you get are stories about him in baseball. You don't really get anything, I mean, even the gambling side, or even the problems with law and so on. I think if people in New York City who were reading their newspapers in the mid-20s, I would think if you sort of surveyed them, they would be pretty clear that Charles Stoneham was guilty of the things that he was, being charged with. He it turned out, hired the best attorneys and managed to thwart all of that. But I don't think in the minds of most readers. But that wasn't what the writers dwelled on. They dismissed that, and they wrote about him as a baseball man, as a private baseball man at that. He was right. The writers say he was always in the background. He didn't particularly like to give speeches. He let his secretaries and his managers, first John McGraw, then Bill Terry. This is what they got. So again, that's part of that mysterious life that he led. And it
Tennessee Mountain Landis had nothing to say about any of this. He was fine with it.
Yeah. Landis reprimanded McGraw, and famously, he reprimanded McGraw and Stoneham twice. First, he said, "You've got to get rid of your Havana racetrack. You can't own a racetrack and a casino." And this is, of course, on the heels. I mean, right in the very time that he was taking a broom to baseball, and anybody involved in gambling at all was, or fixing. I mean, that was clear that they were on the permanent ineligible list. That was 1921 when he just said to them, "You've got to decide if you want to be in baseball or you want to be in the casino business." Well, they decided to sell the casino, but he again reprimanded him about 6 or 7 months later, when Arnold Rothstein was showing up in Stoneham's box as a guest. And the commissioner got wind of this, and he told Stoneham, under no circumstances, I mean, he wasn't convinced that Rothstein was exonerated when he went to the grand jury in Chicago. He was exonerated. So he was out of all the official, legal maneuverings. But Landis had his own legal background, as you well know, and he was pretty convinced that Rothstein was in the middle of that scandal. And so any appearance from Rothstein at the ballpark, especially in the owner's box as a guest, this rang all kinds of bells. And so he told Stoneham, "Okay, none of that anymore." And Stoneham complied. He told Rothstein, your past days are over, no more passes. And the commissioner has spoken. So in that sense, yes, he ran into a bit of resistance. But when Stoneham died, Landis issued this very perfunctory praise. He told a press release that Charles Stoneham was a very fine baseball man. I mean, it was almost so vague as to be questionable.
Any other questions?
Thank you.
I have another question, Rob, for you. As a New York Giants fan, I always was curious as 1926, when McGraw and I guess Stoneham traded Frankie Frisch for Rogers Hornsby, and Hornsby ends up tumultuous year. He ends up fighting, I understand, with McGraw and Stoneham, and they finally shipped him off to the Boston Braves. What was this? Any insight onto what was going on when they? I know they wanted to bring Hornsby in because they were afraid of Ruth attracting all the fans. Go ahead.
Well, I have a chapter on that in the book, a full chapter on the entire deal. It went on for a while. They were courting him for almost 6 years before they landed him. And Branch Rickey, who was the Cardinals GM at the time, always had the same conditions that Frankie Frisch had to be traded. Well, it was a quid pro quo. And McGraw refused to give up Frisch. So it was almost comical the way the script went. It just always was the same thing for 3 or 4 years. And McGraw finally got so annoyed. He says, "I'm done. I don't care. The Hornsby thing is over." Well, it wasn't. And one of the reasons it wasn't is that McGraw soured on Frisch. They had a falling out, and Frisch famously, I think that actually it may have been the series in St. Louis, now that I think about it, but it was maybe either St. Louis or Chicago. They were on the road, and Frisch just decided, "I'm going home. I've had it. I don't want to be this guy's whipping boy." McGraw would single him out and yell at him, and when they'd lose a game, it was all his fault and so on. And he did this over the years to various people. He always said he thought he picked the guy who could take it, but in this case, Frisch had boiled over, and so they had a falling out. And Frisch was out of he went home on a mental leave or something, but he didn't play for about 3 weeks, and he finally came back and finished the season, but he never ever got into McGraw's graces again. And that was in 1925, the season, and then McGraw was ready to get rid of him, and he said, "If that's still a condition, we'll comply with it. You can have Frisch." And Frisch went on to, as you know, to the Cardinals. So they brought in Hornsby, and everything was great at the beginning. And it was really Stoneham. It was a joint decision. Stoneham was aware of Ruth's box office appeal and thought that if they could get a real star to combat even though they were in separate leagues, they were competing for the same market, you might say. And he wanted a star that was, could combat Ruth's star status, and he thought, they thought Hornsby would do the bit. It was a completely a misreading of everything. So Hornsby was the opposite kind of character as Ruth. He was not a team player at all. He was not an interesting guy and with his fellows. He criticized everyone. He was very aloof, and he didn't work well in the clubhouse. Now, to give him his due, his year with the Giants was phenomenal. I mean, if you look at go to baseballreference.com and look at his year, it's just tremendous. And even as a manager, he had to take over because McGraw ran into some health issues. He took over mid-season, and his record is better than McGraw's as a manager. But what happened is he crossed the line with Stoneham, and they got into a discussion, and he basically told Stoneham off and told him he was a drunk, and he should stay back in the bar and let people who know baseball deal with it. And that was it for Stoneham. He didn't even consult with McGraw. He basically traded. He normally would let McGraw handle all the personnel decisions. This time he called the Braves and he said, you want Hornsby? And of course they were flabbergasted. He got nothing for him. A couple of journeymen. I don't even think he got any money. But at any rate, Hornsby's great moment in New York was 1 year, and he was out. And the season he had was tremendous. So it was really personal. Stoneham's ire was up. He was annoyed, and he pulled the trigger quickly. And McGraw was stunned. McGraw found out about it when McGraw was on holiday, that Hornsby was gone. But the boss was the boss. The boss decided. The boss did it. And this is really the first time in their, what should I say, in their association, that Stoneham really acted as an owner and said, "You know what? I don't want this. We're going to do it this way." And it was a surprise everyone was caught off guard. It was this story of the the month when he was traded, even coast to coast. The LA Times had a big to do about it. It was huge and shocking.
Of course, then Hornsby ends up as a coach with the Mets in 1962, so he ends up back in the Kohler grounds.
Well, he had if you look at Hornsby's career, I mean, he was, of course, a stalwart fixture with the Cardinals. But once he gets to the New York Yankees or the Giants in 26, he then becomes this revolving door. He's with everybody. And he seems like you have to keep where's Waldo? You know, that kid's puzzle. You don't know where he is the next year. You know, so that, and it had a lot to do with his taciturn personality. He was a very, very difficult person to deal with.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Well, Rob, you really have painted a picture of a very fascinating individual in Charles Stoneham. Of course, you know, I have my own personal, I used to go to the church, All Saints Church, where his funeral used to be, in Jersey City. And, you know, one thing I was fascinated, it seemed like the train pulled into Jersey City, took the coffin and went right to the church, and they had the funeral right then.
That's right. That's exactly what happened.
Yeah.
It was honesty. It's such a mysterious thing. It was done so quickly, and no one was allowed in the church. Horace had the Monsignor, who was the pastor, agreed that there would be 4 clergy, 3 of them in a high requiem mass, three clergy, and then Meenum was the pastor. Was there on the altar as a witness, and there were only 7 people in the church. So the clergy almost outnumbered the mourners, and the doors were locked, and no one was allowed in. It was just a strange situation. But again, this is a strange man.
Yeah. How about if anybody's interested in the book? Can you show us the book?
Oh yeah, sorry. It's let's see, right here. It's can I, if you guys can see it, it's Jazz Age. They did a wonderful. I thought the cover was terrific. It's got Stoneham there with his Jazz Age hat, and the graphics around the cover are quite nice to indicate the connection with Gatsby and the Roaring Twenties.
Mhm.
Well, once again, thank you very much. Is Peter back?
Yeah, I'm here, guys.
Oh, okay. There you go. Okay. Thank you, Rob. That was
Thank
great
you, and I
talk.
All right,
apologize.
well,
I apologize to everybody here for this startup. John, thank you for calling me. I was embarrassed when you called me, and I'm so sorry that I delayed everyone. So thanks for the chance to be involved here.
Hey, more than it made up for it with a great talk. Thank you.
Absolutely, yeah. So for those of you who don't know, in baseball history today, Baltimore people
Pete, you kind of faded out. I didn't hear you.
know it.
Yeah, he's fading out to me too.
Yeah,
Peter?
it's frozen now.
It's 21-31 day, and also Eddie Murray's 500th home run.
Okay.
Cool.
Little unstable.
Yeah. Well, we got the 21-31 day and the 500th home run. So
Yep.
there are other tidbits you
All right.
had there.
Well, for those of you who are still on, thank you very much. Hopefully, we'll see you at the next meeting, the last day of September. And
Well, again, thank you all for hosting me, John. Thank you, and I wish everybody a nice evening.
Take care
Thank you.
now.
Thank you.
Okay.
Right.